Okay, hello everybody. We'll go ahead and get started here for sort of the beginning of week 13. We'll talk about where we are and where we're going to go. I don't think there's anybody on our live Zoom feed right now, at least I don't see anyone. So I was a little late getting this going, but I just wanted to make sure that I had everything laid out for you for the rest of the semester so that you are familiar with what's going on and where we are, where we're heading. Today we're going to finish up chapter 10, which deals with those last two market structures. And we're really on the last of those four. We're on oligopoly. We began talking about that on Wednesday of last week. So I'll finish up that discussion. And then a nice follow-on to the whole discussion of market structure is that of regulation, specifically antitrust regulation, which we'll talk about today. Hopefully we'll get through all of that today, and then we'll move forward. On Wednesday, we'll cover chapters 12 and 13, which really, and I think I've mentioned this before, is really one chapter. It's a lot of micro textbooks put externalities together, both positive and negative, in the same chapter. They may differ in the sense that the whole issue of types of goods, and we'll introduce another type of good called public goods, which are associated with positive externalities. Those may be split up into a separate chapter. So really it's one discussion. I am not going to try to shoehorn in chapters 14 and 16. I've already decided chapter 14 was going to be out. So I asked everyone to sort of scratch that from their syllabus. I don't think I want to try, as much as I would like to talk about chapter 16, I don't think it makes sense to try to gallop along at breakneck speed in order just to get there. I think that, and as I mentioned in the class before, this is this is the first time we've done this course in the Attend Anywhere format. And as I mentioned before, I think the expectation was that we would have probably the majority of students actually appear in class. In fact, we've had almost nobody appear in class. Everyone's watching either remotely on Zoom live or even more predominantly on the internet, on the YouTube video as it's replayed later. So, the times that we have sort of devoted to the class sections for exams, really, we thought we were going to have in-class exams. And so I think we'll probably rethink this as we go forward. That doesn't make any difference to you. I realize you won't be here to take the next course, but I'm just trying to explain to you why we're dropping things off. It's good news, probably good news for you though, in the sense that you have fewer chapters to read as opposed to more. But as many times as I've taught this course, this is the first that we've taught it in this particular format. So it's sort of a learning process, and I do think there are a lot of virtues with this format, particularly for you all, given the flexibility that I hope this affords you. And I hope this has been a good experience, at least from the standpoint of how you attend class. Maybe micro is not your thing, maybe econ is not your thing. I get that, believe me, I do get that. But at least in the delivery method, hopefully that works for you, okay? So 12 and 13, we're gonna stop at 13, dealing with externalities. Next week, when we come back, if whatever we don't have done here, we'll pick up on Monday. And then the majority of the class period on Monday, we'll talk about the exam. The fourth exam, which is coming up next week. It'll be available on Wednesday, sometime during the day on Wednesday. Hopefully, as soon as I can get it available. I had a little bit of issues getting it available on the third exam, just some technical deals where it wouldn't upload correctly. I don't know what that was about, but we got it resolved in Brightspace, and so it should be available. And again, that will be available through Sunday evening. That is a week from this Sunday. So no exam this week, exam next week. And so, excuse me. Just as a reminder, once again, the first four exams, the lowest of those exams is dropped from this final grade calculation. The final exam, which is in the very last week 15 of class, is not dropped because we're required to have some sort of final assessment. So that's also worth 100 points. I'll tell you much more about that on Monday, 2 weeks from today, when we talk about the final exam and what that's about. And that will do it. So we will wrap this whole discussion up after chapter 13, after this week. And then from there, it'll just be the assessment periods for exams. And so I'll be available throughout the entire period. If you need to get with me, I'll be available to answer questions and whatnot. Okay. All right. So questions for me. Looks like we do have some attendees who are logging into the system now, so that's good. I have not emailed out you yet the PowerPoints for chapter 13. I will do that, or for week 13, which includes chapter 13. I'll do that as soon as class is over. So you look for those. You won't really need those because those deal, I mean, for today's class session, you won't need them because they deal with externalities. And so we're still really working off just the last back half of the slides for last week, dealing with chapter 10. So we're going to finish up that bit of business and then talk a bit about antitrust. Chapter 11, as I mentioned before, there's a lot going on there, and I think that there's probably more than what I want to cover in class. I think that the main things that I want to cover are what I've essentially laid out for you in the PowerPoint package that you're going to be getting. And we won't really get much into it. Well, actually, the antitrust was last week. So so chapter 11, the only part of it that we'll cover is what you've been given for the most part. I may talk a bit about some of the, well, I will talk about the way that we measure market concentration. And I'll probably get to that on Wednesday. If maybe today, we'll have to see how it goes. But if we do, that's great. So, in terms of chapter 11, there's a lot going on there. I do want to cover some of the main points, but not every last point. And I think, like every instructor, I don't cover every single. I don't really teach the book. I sort of use the book as the reference you can follow along with and get additional background and context as we prepare the material leading up to exams. Okay. All right. So if there are no questions, I'll go ahead and pick up our conversation about oligopolies. And so remember, of the 4 market structures, and we had 4, that hopefully by now this is sort of burned into your brain, hopefully not literally. We had perfect competition and monopoly, and we presented those as being polar opposites of one another, and so they were almost every characteristic of perfect competition that you could flip around backwards. It would sort of describe monopoly, with the exception of the goal of all firms, which is to maximize profit. That is at least that objective is common to both of those structures. But then we had this sort of weird hybrid that was called monopolistic competition. And I guess weird's maybe not the word, because it's a very common form of market structure, but it's different in the sense that it combines elements of perfect competition and monopoly. Usually how it works is that while the brand strength remains, and there's a strong branding and product differentiation, monopoly pricing at minimum can be achieved. If not, long-term economic profit that monopolies are expected to achieve. At some point, goods will replace them. There will be substitutes. There will be competing brands. The brand itself will weaken over time. There have been brands that are just sort of beaten up and banged up that have been around for a very long time that no longer really command the brand loyalty and strength. Sometimes because the major devotees on the consumer side have gone away, died off, frankly, put it bluntly. Something like Lucky Strike cigarettes and Hills Brothers coffee. These really old school brands that are still out there. I presume they're still out there. I don't regularly look for them, but they've been around for a very long time, but they don't command much brand strength or even sort of an awareness at this point. So in which case monopolistic competition reverts to perfect competition in terms of zero long-run economic profits, what we call zero profit equilibrium. And then the last one is the one that we began talking about on Wednesday, that was oligopoly. And we said that of these 3 together, they're defined by what they're not. That is, they're not perfect competition. So we describe them collectively as imperfect competition. And some of the things that they have in common is the fact that price and marginal revenue are not one and the same. So we're going to erase this here. Price and marginal revenue are not one and the same, that they are different in the sense that they have the idea of a quicker, faster sloping marginal revenue curve, a steeper sloping marginal revenue curve. So on your basic dollars versus quantity plane, you have something like this going on. And this has come with all 3 market structures. You have a demand curve looking something like this, and you've got a marginal revenue curve looking something like this. Oops, that one's totally dead, isn't it? And so what you end up with then is this. This is common to all 3 of those market structures. Okay, that's very common to all market structures. And then within that, then all firms and all industries, and again, this is in your PowerPoint package for every one of these market structures. If you've got a marginal cost curve, which is pretty much analogous to the supply curve, there are some greater differences, but for our purposes here, they're one and the same. And so all firms and all industries will produce the output level, this Q at which marginal revenue was marginal cost. And they'll simply mark up the price to the demand function and charge the price that is willing to be paid by those willing to, as part of the demand function, willing to be able to pay the price given that particular availability of output. Okay, and as a result, then, to the extent the price is greater than average cost, the firm can earn economic profit in the short run, in the long run, or whatever. We talked about the idea that some brands in monopolistic competition have this long run super brand strength, and so they can maintain economic profits seemingly indefinitely. And there are some consumer goods that we talked about with regard to that. And one common feature of those is that the good itself, the brand name of the good itself, is oftentimes synonymous with the entire class of goods of which it is representative, whether it's Kleenex or Reynolds Wrap or Arm & Hammer baking soda. People usually refer to the good as the brand itself. Okay. Now, one of the things about oligopoly that we said was that the form of the good is not that critical, and there is overlap between oligopoly and monopolistic competition. And I had noted with some chagrin that I had sort of fallen into the trap of taking the auto industry, for instance. And as I sort of went on the soliloquy last week about how the auto industry is probably more monopolistically competitive than it is oligopolistic, despite the fact that for decades, really, economists almost use the auto industry as the prime example of an oligopoly. We had, particularly in the domestic market in the United States, we had essentially three competing firms: Ford, GM, and Chrysler, and then all the sub brands that went into that. So with Ford, you had Mercury and Lincoln. With GM, you had Chevrolet and Pontiac and Buick. I know Pontiac is gone, Oldsmobile is gone, all that. But they were all of the three main competing firms. And today, with all the other brands, many of them non-US brands, it's really hard to say that the auto industry is oligopolistic. Even though I've got it listed here as an example. So we may still be in this transition period where not everyone is a believer in that. And by the way, back in the early 2000s, I remember, as we were coming out of the recession of 2001, 2002, some support for the idea of auto industry as oligopoly was given when I think it was GM introduced its employee pricing for all. And it was immediately copied by Ford. I think it was GM and copied by Ford, not the other way around. Employee pricing is simply the idea that employees who work there get a discount, as well as their family members, I think dependents and whatnot. And then that was going to be made available to all consumers. And so you, in fact, get a discount. It was sort of a sales gimmick. I have a hard time believing that all car dealers went along with that, because my experience with car dealers is that they'll charge whatever price they can get away with. And, and they'll use whatever tactics they want, free hot dogs, balloons for the kids, whatever, to charge whatever price they're able to get. But nonetheless, it was a gimmick. And the fact is that beyond that, it was the leading and following behavior. And so if you look at the characteristics of oligopolies in your PowerPoint package from week 12, it talks about leading and following, leading and following. This is really emblematic of an oligopoly, and it almost is a single example of an oligopoly, is the fact that if one firm does it, another firm does it, and another firm does it, and that's the leading and following behavior. So that's what sort of gave a bit of support to the idea of the auto industry as being that. I think that, so that's been about a good 20 years from now, so I don't know that we see that so much anymore. I think instead, we're probably closer to monopolistic competition. My point is that there is overlap, and there are some examples that are very clearly monopolistic competition. Some of the consumer packaged goods like shampoos and trash bags and candy bars, those are all very clearly, snacks and sweets and all that good stuff. They're all very clearly branded, monopolistically competitive, and they've got to be competitive on price, but to the extent that they can command a higher price for various reasons, these sellers will try to do so, okay? In the case of oligopoly, however, the key issue here really is structure and really is barriers to entry. And so I think that's really sort of where we left off last time, was talking about this idea of barriers to entry and economies of scale. And in fact, remember we talked about barriers to entry before, and this discussion goes back a ways. In fact, I think we talked about it initially with perfect competition, and talking about it in the sense that with perfect competition, there were essentially no barriers to entry. And when we say no, we're saying that yes, there may have been barriers, but they were small enough and surmountable enough that they really represented not very much difficulty. With monopoly, they're very high barriers, very high insurmountable barriers really to get into a monopoly condition. Monopolistic competition, fairly low barriers to entry and exit for that matter. With oligopoly, fairly high barriers to entry. And this is really what explains oligopoly as much as anything else. These industries are really expensive to get into, and to start a business in one of these industries from scratch with no customers and no revenue, and yet all of the associated costs that you've simply got to cover somehow. You've got to raise the financial capital in order to do it. It's not insurmountable, but it's tough. It's tough to do. And one way that new entrants come into the market is simply by buying their way in. So Comcast bought Universal, which owned the NBC networks, NBC, CNBC, all of that. Universal was initially started out, I believe, as a movie studio, television studio, and now their parent is Comcast, the cable company. And I think they did it because cable is probably a dying business, frankly, and satellite probably for that matter as well. And so they wanted to sort of broaden their reach. And so they're a big giant company, Comcast that is, so they're able to sort of buy their way in. But that doesn't change the number of competitors, really, because we've really only had one new addition to the list of broadcasters, who, by the way, is one of the examples that we'll give when we talk about specific oligopolistic industries. There's only like one, and that's Fox, which is owned by News Corp, which is sort of British, sort of American company. Fox and I think Fox Businesses and Fox Sports, and so this was not a major competitor 30 years ago or so, but now is. But there's not like a great rush for new competition coming to the market. It's really hard to get in with cost and market share. Plus, there are licensing issues, which themselves serve as a barrier to entry. One of the things we said about it was that products tend to be similar and often nearly identical. What was the example that I gave last time was, and I just think it's a great example for those of you who, even if you don't watch football, there's a chance that you have seen a game on TV somewhere, sitting in a restaurant or whatever, where you've got that yellow line that shows where the first down line is. And I think somebody came up with it for the first time, and then everybody immediately copied it. And today, if you watch a football game and you don't see the yellow line, you're disappointed. You're upset. You've got to have that, right? And and some of these innovations don't stick. Like I think, without belaboring the whole football example, I think that somebody tried to paint the entire goal line at 20 yards red because it's the red zone. People didn't really like that so much, but they do like that yellow. It's always yellow, same thing, exact same thing, right? Example of where the first down line is. That's the example of leading and following. The leading and following discussion in the text and pretty much everywhere usually revolves around price. And that's important because price is one easy way to look at it, particularly if you look back over time, you can see leading and following behavior in terms of price. But it's also product attributes as well, which also follow along. And just to keep the broadcast example going, in broadcast news, right? Whoever came up with the scroll at the bottom saying, just so you could read along with what's happening somewhere around the world or whatever in news, everyone else has got that. So if you watch the cable news networks, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, they've all got that same little scroll, little ticker running down at the bottom of the screen. That's always there. And they'll say live or not live, right? So these are all copying behaviors, leading and following. But as to the issue of price leadership, price followership, one of the examples that I gave last time was that of airlines, which I think in terms of leading and following is a really great example. And the example that I had talked about was that of booking a flight. If you go into Expedia or Travelocity or whatever, and you just put in a flight, and I do it periodically when I'm planning a vacation, and I'll punch in Albuquerque to LA or Albuquerque to Orlando, whatever, where we are thinking we're going to go on vacation, and we'll get the first half a page of an itinerary of this airline, this airline, this airline, this airline, different airlines, Delta, United, American, and they're all the exact same price, different departure and all that, but exact same price, not close, identical. It's leading and following behavior, no question about it, right? And then as the itineraries change and I think you have to scroll down to get some of the cheaper flights, you have to have layover in God knows where for 8 hours, but they're not quite the same product, are they? So you kind of get the idea. That's price leadership, price followership, and that's an example of an oligopolistic industry. And I don't think there's any question whatsoever that the airline industry is nothing but oligopolistic, despite the fact that they have tried their best over many decades to say United is just an awesome airline. You love it. You love flying on our airline, or American or whatever. The only airline I think that's even had a degree of success, and it's been successful, is Southwest, mostly because of a little bit of a different model that was frankly arrived at accidentally, because it started out as a regional airline just to fly business travelers from places like Houston to Dallas, San Antonio to Dallas, Dallas to El Paso. It was just a Texas airline, and they just point to point. They weren't set up ever initially, at least, to be this national airline that flies all over. And so they always had sort of a whimsical thing. They used to, at one point, one of their marketing gimmicks was giving away bottles of whiskey to travelers, which I'm sure they don't do anymore. At least I've never seen that happen. I think I remember that. Just oddball kinds of things that small airlines that are trying to get market share will do, just kind of wacky ideas. Today, Southwest looks a lot more like the other airlines in some respects. And but to the degree that there's brand loyalty, almost monopolistically competitive. So Southwest is probably the only airline that approaches that. In fact, as I think I said in class before, if you were sitting on if you fell asleep, and sometimes if you're on an airplane, you fall asleep, you sometimes forget what airline you're on. It's that common of an experience. It's practically identical. That's what's really going on with oligopoly. They're not really that much different. They're not really in the essence. So let's talk about economies of scale, because this really explains this limited number of competitors. Scale acts as an entry barrier. Now remember what economies of scale are, just as sort of a repeat here, because we first talked about it in, I think in Monopoly. Well, we talked about it with regard to natural monopoly, but it's the case of any firm that can achieve it, particularly imperfectly competitive firms where you've got, let's put a fairly long tail on this horizontal axis here. And you've got a combination of ATC, short line curves, we'll call ATC1, ATC2, ATC3, ATC4. Now maybe we can keep going on this however long we like. But what are these? They're different input combinations, right? Remember, if costs are the dollar reflection of inputs, that is, inputs create costs. So inputs measured in units like workers and plants and machines, they're represented by dollar costs, which are the costs of inputs. And so different input combinations are going to result in different cost combinations over time. And we're saying these little U-shaped curves are short-run average cost curves. But because they're functions, right? And they are mathematical functions. You can add them up and arrive at one long amalgamation, one aggregation of all these curves. You can end up with the long-run average cost curve. Long-run average cost curve, which basically has two main elements. Well, I guess three, because you've got a least cost element here. And I haven't really talked much about that because, in fact, you could have a very long range here. It could be more horizontal for quite a long time, where you don't really need to change input mixes greatly. You may need to replace equipment, and workers will come and go and whatnot. But for the most part, the main issues that we're talking about here are expanding output while costs are falling. And this is what economies of scale is. The reduction in the cost of production per unit as output is increasing. And then at some point, if a firm gets too large, as output increases, we have diseconomies of scale, just the opposite dynamic, diseconomies of scale. But economies of scale are a good thing. They're a beautiful thing, aren't they? Because it explains too why it doesn't cost very much for these big competitors to produce a single unit of output. And remember, one of the characteristics of oligopoly is that we're talking about big business and maybe a handful or a couple of handfuls of competitors. And so remember, let's not fall into the trap of thinking because we're in a small town, for instance, and there are two gas stations that they're somehow oligopolistic. that might not be right. Well, maybe gas stations is not a great example because they do watch each other's prices. We know that. So maybe there are, let's say, two drugstores in a small town. Are they really watching each other strategically and paying attention to what each other's doing? If one person puts a sale on light bulbs, the other has a sale on light bulbs. I think it's a hard sell to believe that. I really do. Or if there are three veterinarians that they're all watching each other and surveilling each other. I was going to use the word spying, which there is a degree of spying which goes on in the business world. In fact, when I was in banking, which in a lot of local markets certainly is a oligopolistic industry now nationally, I think it's hard to say that among big banks it's not oligopolistic. One of our sort of non-main tasks, but a task was to keep an eye on what the competition is doing, to the point where sometimes they would have people call around to find out what the rate would be on a 6-month CD or a car loan or a home equity loan or something like that. If we couldn't get the information from the newspaper or whatever, it was sort of this competitive intelligence. And you can't do it if you're in perfect competition. And what would be the point? I mean, everyone's charging the same price. It's a price-taking industry. With monopolistic competition, it almost doesn't matter what your competition is doing if you're able to get the higher price, right? And monopolies could care less about competition because it's non-existent. But with oligopoly, there's a lot of this watching and seeing what others are doing and then adjusting, making changes right away. If my competitor does this, I've got to do this. Certainly in terms of price, okay? Certainly in terms of price. But here's the thing, though. One of the reasons why firms are locked out is because you've got a really long run line here of quantity. And so to get up to even the point of minimum, what we call the least cost output level, you've got a long way to go. And we don't have any numbers on here or anything like that. It's just a model, but you've got a long way to go. And if you're coming into the market here, with a demand curve that cuts right here, you've got a really high cost per unit compared to a competitor who's been out there for a while, who is a much lower cost per unit. It's this slice of cost, which may be insurmountable, And I say maybe because it's not always, and in fact, the example of Southwest Airlines is a really good example. Southwest Airlines has been around since I think the late 60s. For the first couple of years of existence was mostly shut down because of lawsuits. Bigger competitors didn't want to compete. So they just started to whittle away at market share slowly. They advertise themselves as a cheap provider. You don't get an assigned seat. It was basically sit down and shut up kind of thing. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but we'll get you there quickly, and no hassle and all that. And they eventually cut into the market share, and I think also took advantage of the fact that the big airlines have long gotten themselves into this business of over-investing. And then when the economy goes south, people don't travel as much. It'll be very interesting to see whether or not the airline industry really ever makes a rebound in terms of business travel, which has been, frankly, it's bread and butter. Because what's the thing about business travelers that we should know about? They tend to travel on fairly short notice, therefore they pay the quote unquote full price, as opposed to leisure travelers who know they're going to go to Disney World in 2 months, and so they book it well ahead of time. And by the way, it can change it if they find a better deal. I think they've got a time frame when they're going to get that done by, but if they get a better deal, they can walk away. So they've got to be more competitive in terms of price. And there's a lot more price elasticity with consumers. Whereas if it's too expensive to fly, then the family may decide to drive or to do whatever, take the bus, whatever, or don't go, just have a staycation, right? Business travel is not usually the case. However, obviously with the pandemic and the fact that we all now are Zooming, which is what we're doing right now, right? Is business travel going to be that necessary? I don't know. I am not completely sure that it will be. And I think a lot of businesses are even sort of adjusting to the new reality of people not even having to commute into the office on a routine basis. And you have some firms that are pushing back. And I know the CEO of one of the top execs of Bank of America just said last week that we are a work at work company. So work at home doesn't work for them. They're a work at work. So not everyone's going to be going along with it, but gosh, you got to wonder. I mean, I guess if I could move this classroom to my house, I would do it there. I don't think that would serve the purpose of the attend anywhere when you're allowed to come to class. But Certainly I've taught enough online classes where, you know, I could do it from anywhere, you know, that sort of thing. So I think we're wondering about the future of that particular industry, and to the point where why would anybody want to get into an industry that may not be viable in the long run? That itself is a barrier to entry. So economies of scale are a barrier to entry. It's tough to get into it. Why get into it? Also, one of the things we talk probably not enough about, but we do talk about it in the same breath usually as barriers to entry, and that's barriers to exit. And that is, barriers to exit are simply anything which prevents you from leaving that industry. How do you get out of something once you're in it? And I think this is an important thing to think about. And we probably don't talk enough about this in business related classes, but what do? We don't like what we're doing and we want to do something else. How do we get out? How do we get out? Now, I may be more sensitive to that kind of question because in finance, we talk about that a lot. We're going to do a deal, but how do we get out of it if we don't like it, if things go south? What do we do? What's our escape hatch, right? But I think marketing companies and manufacturers and service companies all need to really be thinking about how do we get out? Well, if you're in the airline industry, there's no way you're going to convert the airline industry into something else. You can't take planes and make them into hotels, I don't think, right? You know, and that's an important consideration is how do you get out of whatever it is you're doing? If you can't get out, then why get in? So it's an important issue. Barriers to exit are in themselves a barrier to entry. Okay, they're often heavily regulated by government. This is going to be a theme we're going to pick up in chapter 11 when we talk about regulation. Because of the fact that these are dominated by a few firms, and they attract a lot of government regulation, which is another reason why we shouldn't fall into the trap of saying, well, in a small town, you've only got 4 mechanics, therefore it must be an oligopoly because it's between 2 and 12 or whatever the you know, the range is. The sort of accepted number of oligopoly competitors. Well, 4 mechanics, but do they act as an oligopoly? Do they watch each other? Now, maybe they do. I don't know. I suspect not. Do they adjust prices accordingly? I doubt it, really. Do they act as that way? And are there high barriers to entry? Probably not. So I think you have to be a bit careful. In fact, if anything, they may be more perfectly competitive than anything else. Even though, as we have said with perfect competition, that one way to overcome that long-run zero economic profit future that's faced is to maybe just be better at whatever it is that you do than anybody else, even though you're perfectly competitive. And I know that I, as a former banker, had a perfectly competitive, well, a firm in a perfectly competitive industry. It was cutting grass. I'm not talking about cutting people's lawns. I'm talking about well, although they started out that way, it was just 2 guys who started cutting grass for people. They started making a living doing that. And actually, I mean, they actually made a living just as a business, and they cutting grass. And they moved up, and now they cut, you know, with like big tractors. They do like industrial, you know, lands and government property and all that. And they're both millionaires. So they've been millionaires for decades because they just were so dependable and reasonable and easy to work with, and you know, all that kind of stuff. Reputation does matter. So even perfectly competitive industries can do that. So I think you have to be a little bit careful though about immediately saying that there are a few competitors that are oligopolistic. They've got to have those other characteristics of sort of strategic interdependence, which is the term that I used in the above part of the slide. Okay. Now, as to the regulation piece, why do they attract regulation? Because of the need to prevent collusion. We touched on this just a bit last week. Let's talk about what collusion is. Collusion is simply cooperation among sellers. And price is oftentimes one of the factors. I mentioned the example of United Airlines or American Airlines and United Airlines talking on the phone with 2 CEOs, and the American CEO was not just suggesting, but actually recommending that they work together in raising prices. If I raise my prices, you raise yours, we're all happy. And the United CEO smartly said it wasn't going to have any part of it because that's collusion. Working together to raise prices is price fixing, particularly in an oligopolistic industry where your actions are very visible. You just really can't get away with it if it's being obvious as to what's done. So when we say that these firms are competitive, they are competitive, that they are not cartels. And I know the term cartel is used so inappropriately, you know, as we hear it on TV, because oftentimes we hear about cartels and they're usually painted in terms of illegal activity. And yes, it's forming cartels is illegal in the United States. It's illegal in Europe, but it's not illegal in a lot of other places in the world. But when we hear about cartels, we're usually hearing about drug cartels and whatnot. That's really not what's going on. In fact, if anything, they are more integrated from production, processing, distribution, and whatnot. In other words, they're vertically integrated, which does not make them a cartel. A cartel is where we have firm A, B, C, and D working together at the same level to control the price of the good. And we actually call it horizontal integration. That's illegal. If Coke and Pepsi got together and decided to raise prices, that would be illegal. If all the, well, I was going to say insurance companies, but they're more monopolistic and competitive. If the auto industry agreed to sort of raise prices and agree on price increases, that would be an act of collusion, acting like a cartel. So that would be illegal. So, but there have been cartels that have existed before antitrust laws. And we're going to talk about antitrust laws here in just a minute. And that was the idea that you had cartels in things like sugar. In fact, you actually had monopolies in sugar. But to the extent that there was competition, they really tried to work together as cartels, that is cooperating groups of producers. I know there was a vitamin cartel in Europe a few years ago. I know they don't sound very scary, the vitamin cartel. It was mostly vitamins for livestock, and that got broken up by the Europeans. And so this idea of collusion is an illegal activity. Price fixing, working together with your competitors to raise prices is considered to be illegal. And by the way, when we talk about something called predatory pricing, the term predatory pricing might seem like it's that which tries to gouge the demand side, that consumers are being gouged. That might be what that sounds like. In essence, it's not higher prices, it's lower prices. And that is, if a firm is trying to charge lower prices, the predatory behavior is firm on firm. There's another firm trying to drive another firm out of a market, out of an industry, out of business, whatever, by trying to do that. It's not trying to gouge the consumer. If anything, the consumer could care less because the consumer gets a better deal. It's the competitor who is usually smaller and less able to compete that suffers as a result. And I can recall, and probably nobody in the class has ever heard of this company because I'm from the upper Midwest. There was a company called Cub Foods years and years ago that was in the business. They sort of specialized in meat products, like big meat wrapping and meat cutting and all that. And then so they went to war against the bigger stores, and they just were undercutting everybody in terms of meat. And to the point where they were charging below cost, it was obvious. That is another element of price fixing, charging below cost. If it can be proven, it's difficult to prove. It's difficult to prove that a firm is charging below cost. It's really, really hard to prove. It's not as easy as what it might sound like because what determines the cost, who gets to determine it, and who gets to delve into a company's books to do that. Companies don't like to open their books to anybody else about what it costs them to do anything, whatever it is. In this case, it was completely obvious what they were doing. The government told them to stop doing it, so they said, okay, we'll stop. And then they didn't stop doing it. And eventually they were basically shut down, driven out of business, primarily by government regulation. The predatory aspect was one firm on another firm trying to drive another out of business. And so that's an example of that. Which is not to say that all such hardball tactics are not allowed, because they are. One example that I can think of, and I think you could call the home improvement retail industry oligopolistic. I don't think you might have been able to do that 40 years ago when you had all these little Ace Hardwares and True Value Hardwares everywhere. I mean, I don't even know where an Ace Hardware is in Albuquerque. I can tell you where all the Home Depots are, and I think I can tell you where the Lowe's are. But who are the big players? Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart, I guess maybe. Walmart does pretty much everything. And in some markets, you've got other regional competitors, but still that does not add greatly to the number of competitors. And they are very strategically interdependent. They watch what each other does and whatnot. And even still within that, Home Depot a few years ago bought I think it was a company that made like window blinds, like mini blinds. And so they bought the company, and then they stopped selling to Lowe's. And Lowe's said, we want to buy these window blinds. And Home Depot turned them off and said, no, we own the company. We're not going to sell you those window blinds. And Lowe's made some deal of it. The government said, well, that's just too bad. So go buy window blinds elsewhere, that sort of thing. So so there are some tactics that are just rough and tumble, pushing elbows around, and there are others that are completely illegal, like what Cup Foods was doing, with the price of meat. The conglomerate strategy, I won't talk very much about that. That's, in fact, if anything, the trend since World War II was to have bigger firms doing conglomerates. A conglomerate is, I know it sounds like we're talking about conglomerate, the definition of it is some giant business. And I know that we presented oligopolies as being part of big business. Well, conglomerates are designed to be big, and they're usually designed to have different lines of business that react differently depending upon where one is in the business cycle. So they've got a combination of inferior goods and normal goods. So when the economy goes south, at least they can have the revenues buoyed by the divisions that sell inferior goods as where demand is rising for those. So that's really a product of oligopolies for the most part, just because of size and strength. We talked about this, I talked earlier about negative price effect and marginal revenue. And then one final bit is that economic profit is possible in the short run and often in the long run as well. That differs from monopolistic competition in the sense that we said more long run economic profit is possible in the short run. It really varies depending upon the strength of the brand, which is determines pricing power, its profitability power. But in the long run, long run economic profit for monopolistic competition was considered to be zero, like perfect competition. Hence the name monopolistic competition. And oligopoly firms can earn short run economic profit and possibly in the long run as well. This is a little bit more controversial with regard to the long run because industries come and go, and sometimes it's not always clear that you can maintain an oligopolistic presence forever. And I mean, a monopoly for that matter, but some of the monopolies that are around have had quite a lot of staying power. And to the extent that they are the only game in town, you're not really going to have an influx of rivals coming to the market, but you might in oligopoly. And one thing that's interesting about it is when we talk about the long run, the very long run, that what seemed like a difficult business to get into may not be over time as more money is developed and raised to do certain things. There is more and more financial capital sloshing around the world. And so those who have good ideas can oftentimes find people who don't want to return on their money right away at all. Believe it or not, people are willing to pay for large amounts of money with really almost no expectation of ever getting any return back. And maybe they even expect to lose, but they think, what the heck, it might be worthwhile. It might pay off big. It might be that one lottery ticket, so to speak. And the examples are numerous. A lot of the biotech firms in Silicon Valley, a lot of the tech firms that started up never made money for the first few years. There's a company called Genentech that is still around. They've started like in the 70s. It didn't even have a product for years. Didn't even have a product, much less revenue to sell, to earn revenue from the product. And then eventually got a product going, was a viable business. But they had to have money being thrown at them. So my point about oligopolies is that there may be occasions in which investors can put money into them with no expectation of a long run profit, or to enter an industry that's already existing because of the idea that maybe because the population is growing, the world economy is growing, maybe we can afford one more broadcast network, or one more airline, or one more, you name it, that sort of thing, because the economy is bigger than what it used to be. And so you kind of get the idea, but it's got to be financed somehow, and that would be more something that you want to talk about in a finance course, sort of business school kind of course. Okay, some examples, and real quickly, then we'll move on to Chapter 11, antitrust. Some of the ones I've already talked about are at play here. And so, talking about autos and trucks, that was the one I sort of regret a little bit because I think that the stronger argument is for monopolistic competition, but can't really take it back since I already posted that or given that to jet skis and snowmobiles. I think there's a much stronger case for that. There are many fewer competitors in this particular industry, companies that make jet skis and snowmobiles, and and even motorcycles for that matter, than there are auto companies. I think there's a much stronger argument for that. Aircraft manufacturing, certainly no question about it. Consumer electronics. If you think about the companies that make something like refrigerators, remember the sort of as a rule of thumb, and it's not I don't think it's etched in stone anywhere, but one rule of thumb is that maybe an oligopoly is between 2 and maybe at the very outside, maybe 12 competitors, maybe. And that might be an extreme outer edge. But think about the companies that make refrigerators, and we can probably name them: Maytag, GE, Whirlpool, LG. I'm probably missing somebody, I realize, but I don't think we're going to get to a dozen. I don't think we're going to get there. Even something like personal computers, which when you think about the number of competitive firms, I mean, it seems like there are a lot, and there are some that are so small they don't really move the needle that much in terms of market share. But you're talking about HP, Dell, Apple, and there are others. I realize, like Windows. I know they're out there, but that's pretty much oligopolistic, and they do kind of watch what each other does. They all sort of follow along and do the same kinds of things, to the point where I think it's almost becoming sort of a commodity. Frankly, it might even be closer to perfect competition in the long run with computers, frankly, but it didn't used to be at all. And in fact, there have been a lot of computer companies that no longer exist. Digital is gone, Compaq, bought by HP and gone, Wang, Packard Bell. I mean, it's a big, long Commodore, big, long list of companies that no longer exist because it's really moving toward oligopoly. Okay, breakfast cereals. Think about the number of, not the number of brands, but the number of makers of breakfast cereals. Again, this is one that you might be looking at overlap because the brands have brand strength, right? But then the makers themselves are oligopolistic. Post, Kellogg's, Quaker, I think, and we're pretty much quickly running out of competitors. And even though we might get to very small competitors like Cashy, they're not really moving the needle. And by the way, when we talk about measuring market power, we'll talk about how that is measured and why you'll see that these 1%, 2%ers don't move the needle so much to even be really considered to be that critical in our understanding and our assessment of oligopolies. Okay, what else? Cigarettes, no question about it. When we talk about cigarette companies, you've got only a few main competitors that make cigarettes, despite the fact that all kinds of brands. Beer and liquor, and this is an industry that's consolidated a lot because at one time you had 2 domestic companies that produced an extremely large market share. That is total revenue of the firm divided by total industry market share. That was Miller Brewing and Anheuser-Busch. Today, those are both owned by foreign companies. And so as a result, I mean, anytime an acquisition is done of a business, it basically takes one firm as a competitor off of the table. And so as a result, you've got very few competitors that actually produce beer. If you look at all the myriad brand names out there, they're probably made by Anheuser-Busch or Miller. And I know somebody's going to say something about craft beers, but okay, you've got craft beers that have 0.5% market share. And as we'll see when we talk about the Herfindahl Index, that does not move the needle. It doesn't really result in oligopolistic behavior. And in fact, if anything, it's almost like they're carving out a monopolistically competitive niche within that entire business, knowing that they really can't compete with the Anheuser-Busch's of the world and some of the others. And there are regional brands that exist on the East Coast. Rolling Rock is big in the Chicago area where I grew up. Old Style is a gigantic brand. These are all locally owned and whatnot. So, and they do compete as oligopolistic competitors, at least in the regions where they can produce. Coors, by the way, which I didn't fail to mention, but that is a domestic company. Started as a regional company. You could not buy Coors east of, say, I don't know, Kansas for many decades. It wasn't available. They didn't sell it there. And today it's obviously now available, and they've sort of branched out. Again, that's the idea of chipping away at market share in order to elbow your way into what is a crowded industry. Crowded because it's got not a lot of competitors, but not many competitors who don't want you there at the party. No question. And having worked in an oligopolistic industry, the thing that we hated more than anything else was competition. We just didn't like our competition at all. And we did all we could to prevent them from getting up on us. We talked a lot about cable broadcasting. Wireless telephones, I think we're down to what, 4 main competitors now, after we having at one time many more competitors, even local brands. They used to exist in regional brands. Today, what are we down to? Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, and forgetting somebody here, I think. If somebody at home is saying, "Oh, you forgot this, you dummy," well, I know I'm forgetting something. And even if you take like some of the smaller operations like Cricket, I believe Cricket is owned by somebody bigger. And I think there's another sort of lower cost subsidiary that belongs to one of those bigger players, T-Mobile, AT&T, Sprint. Oh, did I forget Sprint and Verizon? And there was a combination in those. I know for a long time, T-Mobile was trying, people were trying to buy T-Mobile and T-Mobile was trying to buy others. And the government sort of kept shutting these down, these mergers all the time. And I haven't frankly looked into it lately to see what the state of play was, but I know for a long time, AT&T was trying to buy others and they were shut down. And we'll talk about why the government steps in to prevent that here in just a second, okay? The legacy airline carriers, I put the term legacy, there has long been considered, we know it's oligopolistic, and that for a long time, we have sort of cut up off Southwest and some of the other really discount airlines as being something separate. I think Southwest, you can kind of move into the mainstream here just because they are big competitors and they now travel to a lot of other areas. The term legacy really relates to the business model of the sort of hub and spoke operational method, which meant that if you flew anywhere on the East Coast on Delta, you'd probably go through Atlanta. If you flew on US Air, you'd probably go through Charlotte. And American, you go through Dallas Fort Worth. It was that hub and spoke, whereas Southwest was more point to point. Although they would be point to point to point to point sometimes if you would do the traveling. So you kind of get that idea there. Okay. All right. So those are some examples. By no means is that are those the only listings of oligopolistic competitors, but I think those are some of the, or I'm sorry, oligopolistic competitors, but those are the main ones there. We'll talk much more about collusion. We'll talk much more about price fixing and all that as we get into antitrust. And let's do that now. Are there any questions from you on anything with regard to Chapter 10, and indeed with all of market structure, which goes all the way back to perfect competition in Chapter 8. Seems like we've been on it for a while, and that is by design, because one of the key takeaways from an introductory micro course is a real good foundation, at least we hope, we intend, for it to be a good foundation in the nature of business, industry, and cost and profit. And those are really indispensable, I think, to business education. Okay. All right, so let's talk about antitrust and regulation. So so first of all, antitrust law is what? Well, it's really a body of law that has been around now for about 130 years, something like that, to the point where it's its own sort of specialty area of the law. Within the US Justice Department, there's an antitrust division that does nothing but that. So they wouldn't pursue drug traffickers or kidnappers. It's just antitrust, which is basically enforcement of business law. Intended to do what? Intended to prevent against illegal formations of businesses, anti-competitive behavior, collusive behavior, all these things which are considered to be inefficient from an economic perspective and a legal perspective. So without getting into too much of the law itself, it's really hard as an economist to talk about antitrust law, not being a lawyer. So I'm not going to get into things like court precedent and whatnot. It's a good thing a lawyer is not teaching this, because he or she would probably get off into the finer points of the law. Instead, we'll look at the law from the economic ramifications of that. So, and we will talk about a couple of examples of laws which sought to protect the public. And it's the public interest really that's at stake here from some of these abuses that might be the natural outgrowth of big business. So we're not talking about small business here. So if we're talking about a single competitor, the only large animal veterinarian in a county, for instance, who can charge whatever he likes to go look at a sick cow or a horse with a broken leg or whatever, then I guess it's theoretically a monopoly. Theoretically, it's anti-competitive behavior, but there's nobody to stop that person. And it's not going to attract federal regulation. It's just not, okay? However, if there's one competing firm that is dominating a market and is doing so by maintaining actions in restraint of trade, which is the legal language there, then that's different. That will attract attention, which is why oligopolies attract attention like nobody's business. certainly monopolies do, but also oligopolies like crazy. Because of the fact that they're very visible, they're easy to see, and they're big businesses, they can be observed fairly easily. Where's the term antitrust come from? So the term trust itself is sort of a legal arrangement. And it goes really back to the early days of industrialization in this country, where as companies got bigger, as the economy grew, the population grew through immigration and high birth rates and economic growth and economic stability and all that, then businesses became bigger as a result, and oftentimes formed monopolies and whatnot. But they did it by expanding across state lines. But in those days, it was illegal for a corporation to cross state lines to do business. And so what they would do is they would simply buy other businesses, and they would simply say, we're legally together as a trust. And they may have different brand names and whatnot, but they're all owned by the same company. And so they're managed centrally. Standard Oil being the exemplar of that. We talked about how they operated across state lines. They created this legal artifice called trust. Not that all trusts are artificial creations. A trust is basically defined as a sort of a confidential business and financial relationship. That's really what it is. It's a legal arrangement. So, and because they're mostly confidential, the government really couldn't pry into what was going on. And it took a very long time for the government to really burrow into what was going on at Standard Oil in order to break it up. A good 40 years until Standard Oil was eventually chopped up into pieces after its formation. So by that time, its founders had become super wealthy. And even after the breakup, as we'll see here in a bit, it didn't really achieve the major objectives until more law was passed, which is why antitrust law has been developing in order to sort of meet the times. And certainly they were well behind the scene. By the way, with Standard, and I think the story of Standard Oil is just so instructive as the exemplar of that particular period of business dominance and the inefficiency or the inability of government to really get at it. I mean, there were times in which John D. Rockefeller, the founder, was subpoenaed to go testify, and he wouldn't show up. Now today, if you're subpoenaed, you don't show up, you usually get arrested, right? But sometimes they couldn't find him, or he didn't want to be found. And even if they did find him, they didn't really have the power to do anything about it. And so not only could you not get a person to show up and just testify, you definitely couldn't peer into their records. And if you could, I think it's probably safe to say that a lot of people wouldn't be able to understand the records. I think they were so complex, such a complicated business entity, that I think it would be very complicated to sort of pick that apart. Not today. Today, we've got people who are trained in forensic accounting. They can pull apart these kinds of things, and they can do it fairly efficiently, which is why if you're going to break the law, which I'm not suggesting you do, but if you do, you're probably better off making your bookkeeping as difficult to get at as possible. I'm not suggesting you do that, but I'm just simply saying if it's very easy to get at, forensic accountants will figure it out. So anyway, but in those days, it was very difficult. So the business was always one step ahead of government. You can say that about so many things. The business oftentimes moves much faster than government. There's no question about that. So these are efforts to prevent the formation of monopolies or to limit the market power. And the two main laws were the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. So the Sherman Act basically was anti-monopoly law that basically said that when monopoly formation is illegal, as are actions, quote unquote, in restraint of trade. That is, if you try to restrain a competitor from competing against you, that's an action in restraint of trade. If you say to a business, okay, like Standard Oil did, okay, you can refine all the oil you want, but I'm going to see to it that no railroad will ship your oil. And if they do, they're going to overcharge you and they're going to pay me the difference. That's today illegal. That was once standard practice. That's an action in restraint of trade, that sort of coercive behavior. That, by the way, as I sort of talked about a couple of weeks ago, was somewhat similar, not completely identical, to how Microsoft was interacting with hardware makers in distributing its software on the computers. That they didn't want competing products to be on. They didn't want two browsers on there. They didn't want two Office type suites, that is, suites of products like word processor, spreadsheet, all that. They didn't want that, so they told hardware makers, if you do it, don't put ours on there. So and they were the dominant brand. They got to call the two. That was considered to be an antitrust violation. wound up in court. Okay, so the examples I think are pretty good ones. So the Sherman Act prevented actions in restraint of trade. 1890 was when the law was passed. Now here's the problem with the Sherman Act. So the Sherman Act has, in fact, it's not so much been amended, but court decisions have sort of modified this a bit. And this is where I do want to start. I'm on a little bit of shaky ground here because, not being an attorney, I don't want to get off of the legal weeds of this case, then, and the decision by this federal district court amended this particular thinking on the matter of antitrust. Antitrust is going through some evolutions. I will say this, though, that there's been some thinking among the federal courts that maybe monopolies aren't so bad, particularly if consumers are not disadvantaged. That really, the question is, are consumers disadvantaged or are they advantaged? And that maybe if a monopoly forms, it's not a problem. So what we learned during the Microsoft trial was that it's not illegal to become a monopoly, because after all, if nobody's going to compete against you and you've done nothing to stop them proactively, then what are you to do? I mean, as Bill Gates said, I can't help it that there's no other competing operating system for Windows. And nobody really was arguing about the Windows issue at all. It was the browser issue and the software and the other software apps that they were worried about. Because, if there are no other competing operating systems, then what are you supposed to do? I do know there are other competing markets, operating systems, but their market share was just tiny in relation to Windows. And so it was the other actions in restraint of trade. So here's the problem with the Sherman Act. The Sherman Act basically said it's illegal to create monopolies or to engage in actions that are restraint of trade. And since then, courts have really held it's not illegal to become a monopoly. So that's been sort of a modification of the Sherman Act. But actions in restraint of trade definitely are. But here's the problem with the Sherman Act, and we'll go back to the example of Standard Oil. Standard Oil was this behemoth, right? That was operating, throughout most of the eastern U.S., but had tentacles pretty much everywhere. And Standard Oil was owned really by two main players, John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler. I don't know his middle initial. So, and those were really the two principal owners, because this is well before the shares sold on the public exchange. First of all, if you're a secret enterprise, you can't very well list your shares on a stock exchange, can you? Despite the fact that disclosure laws then were a little bit different. So here's the thing: when the courts finally, a good 20 or so years after the Sherman Act finally chopped up Standard Oil and said, okay, we're going to make you into different companies. And so you're going to go this way. We're going to have one company that's going to be called SO, which is a play on the Standard SO. That's basically to keep Standard Oil of New Jersey, which is now known as Exxon, right? Mobil, which was another company. Chevron, which was Standard Oil of California. Amoco, which was Standard Oil of Indiana. So Ohio, Standard Oil of Ohio, and many more that spun off of this. And it was some couple dozen, 3 dozen companies that split off. But here's the problem. And that was this. John D. Rockefeller had a piece of this and a piece of this, and a piece of this and a piece of this. And it became sort of the equivalent of a chop shop economic scenario. So what is the logic behind chop shops? Other than the fact that you've got free cars because they're stolen, right? Is the idea that sometimes things are worth more in pieces than they are together. And it turns out these were all worth more in pieces than together. So as a result, the wealth that accrued to the Rockefellers and the Flaglers and Andrews, the original founders of Standard Oil, actually increased, and they still had control, albeit a little bit more indirectly. They were still sort of pulling the strings. So as a result, it wasn't addressed in the Sherman Act, and so it didn't have any teeth. It didn't prevent it. It's like, oops, well, we didn't see that happening. Where now you have all these little baby, you've got the giant dragon here, and now you have baby dragons, but the baby dragons are all now more powerful than the individual ones. And so as a result, it didn't achieve really what it meant to achieve. And so by 1906, I believe it was, the Clayton Act was built, or 1914, which was sometime shortly after the breakup of Standard Oil and the recognition of what that spun. The Clayton Act, which prevented something called interlocking directorates. That was the idea that if we break your company up by saying It's an illegal monopoly. And by the way, almost every action that Standard Oil did to build a monopoly is now illegal. It has been illegal for quite some time. That is the idea of getting rebates on overcharged competitors, locking competitors out of distribution networks, threatening competitors with ruin if they did these kinds of things, spying on competitors, lying to Congress, all that sort of thing. Those are all illegal activities. Interlocking directorates was the idea of let's prevent companies from having the same owners so that they can't be run by the same people. So if the boards of directors are the sort of the overall governing body of corporations, publicly traded corporations. So if you sit on the board of Pfizer, for instance, you can't also sit on the board of say Eli Lilly or some other drug company. If you sit on the board of Boeing, you can't sit on the board of Airbus. Or if you sit on the board of Chevy or GM, you cannot sit on the board of Ford. That's because of this idea of interlocking directorates. And so that was really what was getting at. But the Clayton Act did more of that. Beyond the idea of interlocking directorates, it also got into things like tying arrangements. It prevented firms from saying, okay, you can buy this good, but you also got to buy this good. So if you're a movie distributor, you would say, okay, you can run this movie, which is going to be good, but you've also got to lease this movie, which is not so good. And so that's really how you had this sort of double feature thing that happened, which I know is really going back in time, before my time, where you saw some crummy little movie, but you had to sit through that in order to get to the other movie because they were locked into it by arrangements of tying arrangements. Today, you almost have something even worse because now you've got to sit through half an hour of ads. So you've got to pay for the movie and you've got to pay with your time by watching the ads. And so this drives my wife crazy. And she always wants to go about a half an hour after the movie is supposed to start, knowing that we're going to be looking at commercials. So trying to time that is always a little bit tricky. So you get the idea. One other thing about this too is that part of the problem with the Sherman Act that envisioned breaking up competitors is that it also didn't incorporate this. Exxon and Mobil are now one company again. Exxon bought Mobil, it's another one company again. Chevron and Texaco are one company. Texaco is not part of the original Standard Oil, I don't believe. Amoco is now part of British Petroleum, BP. So there's been a sort of a reaccumulation of power to the point where now we're back to an oligopolistic industry from what was primarily monopolistic. And that's been sort of okay. That maybe the government went crazy. In fact, it was probably the best thing that happened to the owners of Standard Oil because now they were all operating legitimately as above board businesses. And nobody could stop them from making profits on these and these and these, all these little competitors. And by the way, sometimes it's easier to manage something smaller than it is something bigger. I think that's pretty much a good rule of thumb. So the idea of interlocking directorates, that there was one other area that was targeted, and that was the financier JP Morgan. The guy JP Morgan, now his company which still exists today, would often have his agents, I guess, for lack of a better word, sit on boards of industries he was interested in so they could report back to him what was going on, sort of intelligence, so that he could know what to invest in. And if he knew there was trouble in a particular industry, he would hear it firsthand before it ever became public information. And then he would put up somebody on the board of another firm in the same industry. That would be an example of an interlocking director, that idea of spying. And so today we don't think of spying as being all that unusual. JP Morgan was so well ahead of his time, even if it is a little bit maybe on the more shadowy side of things. So, okay, all right. We don't have a lot more to talk about other than the measurements of market power, which we're going to get to on Wednesday. It won't take very long, and then we'll get into the final, the last go around here, new material, and that's dealing with externalities. And so we're pretty much where we need to be. Particularly, I think it made sense to jettison chapter 16. I don't think it makes a lot of sense, particularly since I really want to get this idea of externalities is so important where we are today in our economy, and really in terms of its implications for the global economy are, I think, really important. So it's important we get to that. We'll finish up the antitrust piece and the measurement of market power, the regulatory chapter 11, and then we'll get into externalities. So I don't have too many on the live Zoom feed. Do you have any questions for me? Okay, well, everybody have a great day. I will go ahead and post this video. I'll also send you the PowerPoint slides by email. I'll do that here right now. So have a great day. See you next time.